I'm Paul Whalen, chairman of the Soane Museum Foundation, and I want to thank Bill Appleton, our new executive director, and Jonathan Hogg, director of programming, for bringing us together this evening. We are delighted to have Bruce Boucher, the Deborah Loeb Bryce director of Sir John Soane's Museum in London, here to speak with us on Soane's collecting. Bruce is an art historian and curator specializing in Renaissance and Baroque sculpture and architecture. He studied at Harvard University, Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and at the Courtauld Institute of Art. He is professor emeritus at University College London, where he taught for over 20 years. Before joining the Soane, Bruce was director of the Fralin Museum of Art at the University of Virginia, which followed a role as curator and head of European sculpture, decorative arts, and ancient art at the Art Institute in Chicago. Bruce became director of the Soane in May 2016, where, among many other achievements, he has been responsible for the opening of a variety of rooms not previously open to the public, a project called The Opening of the Soane. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Bruce Boucher, who is a great friend of ours here at the Foundation. We're thrilled that he's here with us tonight. He also joined us at our honors evening last week. We had a wonderful time. And the name of the title of his topic is A Maze Without a Plan, John Soane's Display of Antiquities, which is on its way to becoming a book, which we're all very excited about. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Paul, for that kind introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be back here. I think in this very room I gave a lecture some years ago, and it's wonderful to be with the Soane Museum Foundation, and I'm grateful to Paul and Bill and Jonathan and the whole of the board for making this occasion possible. As Paul said, this is a strand from a book that I've just finished on Soane as a collector. The reason why I decided to write a book about it was that I've often found when I start a new job, I try to make sense of where we are and why the situation or the building, the gallery, whatever, that I'm in is the way it is. It's sort of like looking up the history of a word. But in this case, of course, so much has been written about Soane as an architect, but very little has been written about him as a collector. And so I began trying to sort out various themes in his work, his collection of Greek, or what he would call Etruscan vases, his interest in the Gothic, his interest in ruins, modern British art, particularly painting and sculpture. And one of the things I discovered was, of course, we always think of the Soane Museum as being about classical art, but quite a lot of it would have been, in Soane's day, modern British, because he invested heavily in his contemporaries, exclusively in fellow academicians of the Royal Academy, in a way in which was a kind of, you could say, virtuous circle, because he would buy their works and display them, and it helped also to influence his own standing within the Royal Academy as a kingmaker. I should also say that the title isn't quite right, because there should be a question mark after A Maze Without a Plan. Perhaps this is a Freudian mistake on my part, but I do think that there is a plan here, and I hope that you'll be convinced that there is something to this by the examples that I bring forward. You may recognize the quote, "A Maze Without a Plan," because it comes from Alexander Pope's epistolary poem, An Essay on Man, which begins with an invitation to the reader to expatiate free o'er all this scene of man, a mighty maze, but not without a plan. And it seems an apt way to begin a discussion of Sir John Soane's museum. This is no doubt a fraught subject, And as with Soane's architecture in general, the experience of the museum could never be described as neutral. Ever since the museum first opened its doors, visitors of all kinds have tried to make sense of it, or at least to let it wash over them. So let me begin with a couple of quotes from 3 informed 19th century visitors to the Soane Museum. The first is Carl Friedrich Schinkel, who visited Soane's house in London in 1826 and was baffled by what he saw. This is what he wrote in his diary. Like all private houses in London, this house is small but contains a great number of casts, fragments of antique statues and buildings, vases, sarcophagi, little panels and bronzes, all exhibited in the riskiest manner, in small spaces lit from above and the side, often only 3 feet wide. Medieval, antique, and modern works are intermingled at every level in courtyards resembling cemeteries, and in chapel-like rooms, in catacombs and drawing rooms, ornamented in Herculanean and Gothic styles. There are little deceptions everywhere. Clearly, Schinkel was not overly impressed, and he felt the same way about the Bank of England when he toured it during his time in London. But truth to say, he was more interested in industrial architecture, particularly in the north of England. That was the primary goal of his visit. The second observation is by another German, the distinguished art historian Gustav Wagen. It was published in 1838, 1 year after Soane's death. The rooms, Wagen wrote, are small, and such an immense number of objects are crowded together in 3 different stories that it is the work of some hours to gain even a superficial view of them. I observe that the whole, notwithstanding the picturesque, fantastic charm, has, in consequence of this arbitrary mixture of heterogeneous objects, something of the unpleasant effect of a feverish dream. It is, he concluded, a splendid example of English whimsicalness. Next, 50 years later, an even more damning assessment by the classical scholar Adolphe Michaelis. Non multum sed multa, not much but many, to translate, appears to have been Soane's motto in his collecting, for there is something of everything. Along with the few choice specimens of high value, or at least of considerable interest, there is an immeasurable chaos of worthless fragments of all times, from all countries, of all kinds of arts, originals and copies mixed together. All this is crammed into the narrow limits of a private house and is arranged in so ingenious a manner that no corner, however dark, is left unoccupied. In this respect, the architect has achieved marvels. Nevertheless, this labyrinth stuffed full of fragments is the most tasteless arrangement that can be seen. It has the same kind of perplexing and oppressive effect on the spectator as if the whole large stock of an old clothes dealer had been squeezed into a doll's house. Then again, the impression conveyed by so wild a confusion of promiscuous fragments is necessarily bewildering and fatiguing to the visitor. Now, all 3 of these eminent scholars, German scholars, fastened on what we might call information overload, which can make visiting the Soane an uncomfortable, even tiring experience. If there's a common theme underpinning their passages, it concerns eclecticism, which was and is an issue both with Soane's architecture and the display of his own collection. Elements of his display can find points of comparison in other collections of the period, yet there is much about the Soane Museum that is sui generis. This can be explained in part because it is a rare survivor of a kind of private collection that was common in the London of his day. Nevertheless, the fascination of the Soane Museum also reflects, I think, its place on the cusp of the shift from the Renaissance cabinet of curiosity towards the post-Enlightenment museum. Here, it's worth considering some influences on Soane's approach to display, as well as what we could call the migration of objects within his collection and what they tell us about his strategy of presentation. And I've just been showing you the last 3 slides are watercolors which were all executed in 1825 and bound together in a volume by Soane to show the building at a certain stage in Soane's arrangement of the material. Half a century later, he probably would have had photographs taken, but in his day, it was a way of preserving the interior, and these have been extremely helpful to us as we've tried to reconstitute Soane's original display. In the 18th century, collecting classical sculpture was de rigueur, or as Gavin Hamilton wrote to Charles Townley in 1771, "Never forget that the most valuable acquisition a man of refined taste can make is a piece of fine Greek sculpture." And here I'm showing you a watercolor of the entrance to Charles Townley's house on Park Street in 1794, which, as you can see, was filled to the brim with important classical works, the majority of which ended up in the British Museum, although today, given changes in taste, they're mainly in the basement of the British Museum. Some collectors, like Charles Townley, had a genuine appreciation of ancient art and opened their houses to scholars and other kindred spirits. Indeed, as a Catholic, Townley was barred from public office, which may have directed his energies instead to collecting and to becoming an expert on ancient art. At the other end of the spectrum, there were more superficial collectors like the Duke of Northumberland. And here we're seeing the Long Gallery in Sion House as it is today. In 1765, the Duke of Northumberland wrote to Sir William Hamilton, who was then the ambassador in Naples, asking him to, and I quote, "purchase any statues, vases, tripods, or other pieces of virtu for a proposed museum in the style of a columbarium, which would be fitted into the Long Gallery at Sion House, his seat outside of London." The Duke further stipulated that the antiquities were to stand in niches 4 foot 8 inches high by 2 feet 3 inches broad and 1.5 feet deep, of which there were 10 in the gallery at Sion. There were also, he added, a few circular recesses 18 inches in diameter by 12 inches deep, fit for placing any flat vases or sepulchral urns. Anything the right size would do. But in the end, paintings and casts after the antique were substituted for the Duke's grander scheme. John Soane, by contrast, had the advantage of an extended period of study in Italy between 1778 and 1780, and he was fortunate in knowing some of the major public and private collections there, as well as encountering influential figures like Giovanni Battista Piranesi, seen here on the left. In later life, Piranesi was a constant source of inspiration for Soane, and his private museum and his etchings shaped Soane's view of antiquity, both as an assemblage, such as here in Piranesi's famous reconstruction of the Via Appia Antica, and in terms of the acquisitions that he made. Although Soane's public pronouncements on Piranesi were equivocal and sometimes negative, his imagination was clearly fired by the elder architect's approach to space and the antique. Indeed, his ambivalence may have been influenced by the comments on Piranesi expressed by Sir William Chambers in a letter of advice that he gave to Soane after winning the gold medal at the Royal Academy Schools in 1776. And in this letter, he was telling him what to look at in Rome, and he said, "You must meet Piranesi. You can learn a lot from him, but he's also full of a lot of nonsense." And Soane's public pronouncements in his Royal Academy lectures when he became the professor of architecture after 1806 are really rather cutting about Piranesi. But as people often commented, what Soane said in his lectures and what he did in his architecture were two different things. In any case, a later work, such as the Pasticcio in the Monument Court, which we see here on the left as it was reconstituted about 10 years ago, invites comparison with Piranesi's free creations in his late volume Vasi, Candelabri, Cippi of 1778. I'm just showing you an antique candelabrum on the right. although Soane's pasticcio, as he called it, suggests a chronological progression in the manner of fashionable theories on the common sources of ancient art in Eastern and Western. Soane called the pasticcio an assemblage of ancient and modern art, and he believes that the first capital in the sequence, this one here, was a Hindu capital, as he put it, whereas in fact we know that it is Moroccan, 16th century of the Saadian dynasty. And above it, he put a replica of the Corinthian capital of the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, which was a leitmotif of his architecture. And it's topped by a finial of the kind that is associated with the church spires of Christopher Wren. In fact, the original was taken down in 1892 because it was deemed unsafe, and when it was reconstituted at the turn of this century, a steel rod was put in the center to make sure that it wouldn't fall down. It was part of our, as Paul said, opening up the Soane and restoring as much of it as possible to the way it was in John Soane's day. Again, Soane's interest in acquiring cinerary urns, such as this double cinerarium, was stimulated by the demand for such works that Piranesi created himself through his publications and his own private museum. Soane printed a private, not-for-publication guide to his collection in 1830 and again in 1835, an expanded version of it, and he highlighted this double cinerarium, which had belonged to Bartolomeo Cavaceppi, had been restored by Cavaceppi, and was subsequently owned and illustrated by Piranesi, then acquired by the Earl of Bessborough, from whose sale in 1804 Soane acquired it and a number of other works. I think he spent about £200 at the Bessborough sale. And as was typical of Soane, he was as much concerned with the provenance of the work as with the work itself. And certainly the people that he bought from were considered connoisseurs, and that was a kind of insurance on the quality of the works that he was acquiring. In terms of display, Soane, as a young man, would have noticed the way in which Italian collectors had immured classical reliefs and lapidary inscriptions into external walls of palaces and villas. One of the most celebrated examples was the Villa Medici on the Pincian Hill, which became the seat of the French Academy in 1803. And here we're looking at an anonymous view of the Villa Medici, which then has works immured in the wall, and the garden facade was festooned with reliefs that had come from, among other sources, earlier and similar dispositions in the courtyard of the Palazzo della Valle, where they had been studied and drawn by artists such as Michelangelo and Martin van Heemskerk. Indeed, there's a famous 16th century engraving of the courtyard of the Palazzo della Valle by Heemskerk, which shows the way in which these works were effectively transposed from one building to another in much the same order. This was a model that remained vivid for Soane, and he himself owned one cast of a foliate scroll from the gardens of the Villa Medici, which we're seeing here, which is one of the earliest objects that he put up in the dome area of the museum and has remained there ever since. Now, as a young man on a scholarship in Rome, Soane could not afford to acquire objects, but his collecting was informed by the taste of older architects, among them Sir William Chambers, George Dance, who had been his first master, and Robert Adam. When he grew affluent enough to assemble his own collection, Soane made a point of acquiring works that had belonged to these early mentors. And, like Robert Adam, he deployed his collection of ancient artifacts to confirm his role as an authority on the antique. As early as 1795, he acquired 41 casts from the sale of the effects of a Scottish architect, James Playfair. The casts were placed in Soane's architectural office, then behind his house in number 12, his first house in Lincoln's Inn Field. Soane and his wife had known Playfair, and it was said that he bought these casts to help out the family. Indeed, his wife debated adopting one of the Playfair children, but in the end decided against it. In any case, the purpose of these casts was for instruction of his pupils, and can also be understood as a kind of reference library for Soane himself. In his lectures on architecture, Soane stressed the importance of copying casts because they conveyed more information about an original than a drawing did. Soane had heard the same advice in his student days at the Royal Academy from Thomas Sandby, who was then the professor of architecture, who wrote that the best drawing of an Antinous, Apollo, or the Venice of the Medici cannot convey to the young artist so completely an idea of their beauties and proportions as good, accurate models. And he added, in architecture, they should doubtless be as useful as in painting and sculpture. Now, Soane could never compete with celebrated figures like Charles Townley or Thomas Hope in acquiring originals, but he knew their houses and imitated their displays. Townley favored top-lit rooms with dense but symmetrical hangings against walls of saturated color. When Townley's works were acquired by the British Museum after 1808, they were initially presented in much the same manner as they had been in his house in Park Street, and following conventions seen in country houses of the period. Indeed, the Townley galleries, we're seeing an engraving here of 1812, and the first guide, printed guide by the British Museum to their collection of antiquities. The Townley galleries had been conceived by the architect George Saunders as an extension to Montague House, which was the 17th century house in which the British Museum was first housed. And essentially, he created a wing which was designed much like a country house. And you can see here, in fact, looking through these top-lit galleries, and over here in particular, you see reliefs which are framed in a rather dense way, much like what we still see today at the Soane Museum. And these galleries were preserved, and they kept this sense of a house museum until they were dissolved in the neoclassical galleries of Sir Robert Smirke after 1846. Thomas Hope, who was another important collector as a model for Soane, had a mansion on Duchess Street in the West End of London, and it was of a different order. It was first opened to the public in 1804, and admission was granted to what he termed presentable individuals by reference or personal introduction of any friend of the family, as well as being open to persons of known character and taste. The public rooms on the first floor, and here I'm showing you a room containing the Greek vases from a book he published in 1807 called Household Furniture, which rather disappointingly is just plain black and white illustrations, so they don't give you a sense of the richness of these interiors. The public rooms were on the first floor of the house, and they were given over to the display of his collection, while Hope and his family lived in private apartments upstairs. Thomas Hope wanted his house museum to serve as a nursery of modern art, and it was a model for Soane's house museum in several key points. It too had top-lit galleries. It showcased vases and columbaria. It also used mirrors edged in black velvet to amplify views of works of art, most notably in the room dedicated to John Flaxman's sculpture of Aurora Encephalus, which also had curtains of black and orange satin. And here you can see on the left the illustration from Household Furniture, which shows you this room, and on the right, the Flaxman sculpture. Hope's suite of galleries were, and here we see them in an elevation by the architect who actually designed them. These galleries were designed by Charles Heathcote Tatham, not well known today, but an important figure in the early 19th century. But he, of course, received little credit from Hope, and in fact these drawings only recently came to light to show the extent to which he was involved in designing the galleries. This is a view of the picture gallery, and you can see that the walls were intended to be a deep red, and again you have this sequence of skylights to provide natural light. Sohn visited Hope's collection in 1802 and again in 1804, and he was inspired to introduce the idea of urns and niches into the library of his country house, Pitzhanger Manor, in a similar fashion in 1803. This is a watercolor which is intended as a design for the display of the library at Pitzhanger Manor, which Sohn owned until 1809, and originally it was designed as a showcase of his collection, but also a showcase of his architecture. And as Susan Feinberg Millinson has convincingly shown, many of the elements of Sohn's later museum in Lincoln's Inn Field were already present in Pitzhanger, and they were simply adapted to the new setting of his townhouse after the purchase of number 13 Lincoln's Inn Field in 1807. A watercolor, in fact, from Sohn's office of 1807, the one here on the left, shows that he already was conceiving of the crypt behind the house as the basement behind the house as a crypt, even before work began on the site. The space of the main floor above was also designated as a cast collection, and the concept of urns and catacombs in the basement, subterranean space, remained a constant throughout the architect's many reorganizations of this area. And I'm juxtaposing this 1808 drawing with a more famous watercolor by Joseph Michael Gandy, who was Sohn's amanuensis for most of his career, of the crypt and dome area in 1813, where you see it being illuminated by night by artificial lighting, viewed from the crypt up to the dome area in a kind of Piranesian concept. Sohn's interiors at Lincoln's Inn Field were enriched by his idiosyncratic reinterpretations of elements of ancient Roman wall decorations that he would have observed in ruins like these lost frescoes, which we see on the right, from the Villa Montalto Negroni in Rome. Those ruins, which we see here in a hand-colored print by Campanella, created a sensation when they were discovered in 1777, just a year before Sohn's arrival in the city, and they rivaled the interiors of Pompeii in the intricacy of their decoration. Sohn would have known some of these frescoes extremely well, as they had been purchased by an early patron, the Earl Bishop of Derry, for installation in his country seat in Ireland. While that never happened, the example of the frescoes were preserved in a series of hand-colored engravings by Campanella, and they remained a constant source of inspiration in Sohn's later years, notably for the implausible pseudo-architectural elements that we see, for instance, here supporting the canopy that separates the library from the dining room in the ground floor of number 13. Another figure who exercised notable influence on Sohn and other earlier collectors was Pierre-François Hugues, also known as the Baron d'Anquetil. He was a fascinating, if rather controversial, character, and he advised a number of major English collectors, including Sir William Hamilton in Naples and Charles Townley. His weighty tomes on the Townley collection were called Recherches sur l'origine des arts de la Grèce and were published between 1784 and 1785. And the text, although it was commissioned by Townley as a catalogue of his collection, turned into a meandering quest for first principles and looked for links between the religions of the ancient world. And here I'm showing you an illustration of the generative bull, the bull as a creator of, or progenitor of the universe, with coins that, in D'Ancaville's mind, linked up with this interest in the bull, and showed that these ideas were current across time and across a number of cultures. D'Ancaville believed that ancient mythology was better understood by studying the visual evidence provided by coins, engraved gems, painted vases, and sculpture, as opposed to studying literature in isolation. He saw the history of forms as intimately connected with the history of religion, and essentially linked across continents through the migration of images. Although much of what he wrote is diffuse and opaque, Sohn was fascinated by his theories and copied chunks of his writing while annotating his illustrations to the text. He was particularly intent on transcribing and translating parts of D'Ancaville's research when he was preparing his lectures on architecture for the Royal Academy. And the frontispiece and also the illustration we're seeing here are taken from Sohn's copy of the Recherche, which exists in it's a 3-volume research piece. And you can see here Sohn has written next to the bull, page 420, I think page 427. So he paid a great deal of attention to this work, as did people like Townley and Hamilton. In fact, he convinced Sir William Hamilton that his collection of what were then known as Etruscan vases were in fact Greek. And he was one of the, and he also convinced Winckelmann, also when Winckelmann came to Naples to see this collection, that they were Greek instead of Etruscan. Here again is another image of from D'Ancaville, showing how these motifs come up and how they are related to more abstract designs. And I'm juxtaposing it with the marbles that Sohn put together in his little study in number 13, which can be seen as a reflection of D'Ancaville's ideas of first principles, or the spirit moving through the arts. For example, here, the use of undulating rhythms of vegetal forms around the fireplace, and the collection of lion's paws that adorn or festoon the window, the latter of which Sohn referred to as of extraordinary execution. It's worth noting that the marbles that are in the little study came from the collection of Charles Heathcote Tatham, whom I've mentioned a moment ago as the architect of the galleries at Thomas Hope's house in Duchess Street. And he collected these in the 1790s in Rome and published a book of etchings after these architectural fragments, which appeared in 1806. And again, this is the Sohn copy of Tatham's book. And Sohn acquired most of these in 1812 when Tatham was in financial difficulties. But contrary to his practice in other parts of the museum, he kept all of Tatham's works together and also illustrated or displayed them, much as they were illustrated in Tatham's book, i.e. grouped according to motifs, as in this page here, which I hope you can see is dedicated to the anthemium motif. In his privately printed description of the house and museum of 1835, Sohn states that had he been able to build his house and museum as a unity rather than piecemeal, it would have looked different. He went on to quote one of his early mentors, the Abbé Laugier, on the plan of a building as manifesting the genius of its creator. It is here, Laugier wrote, that the creative genius can manifest itself through the combinations of spaces, always new and exactly right, toujours nouvelle et toujours également juste. In a sense, Soane's evolving ideas for his house and museum demonstrate an ability to extract the maximum within a relatively small compass. In his guide, Soane provides plans, sections, and elevations to aid the visitor to thread his or her way through the maze. Interestingly, he seems at one point in 1810 to have toyed with the idea of imposing a chronological sequence on his collections, just as he was rebuilding number 13 Lincoln's Inn Field, but practical factors militated against it. And what we have today is much more creative, if somewhat perplexing to the general visitor. So what you have here, he was going to leave number 12 as it was and then create in number 13 a series of galleries would have library, plaster casts, another galleries, and then a gallery for drawings and prints down here. But because of pressure from, I think, cash flow, among other things, he simply swapped houses with the leaseholder of number 13, rebuilt that, and the leaseholder took number 12. But what he did do was to take the area behind the building, which was a yard or stables, and adapt that into number 13. And I think one of the reasons why he was fascinated, or why he wanted to move into number 13 as opposed to number 12, was, as you can see, it has a much bigger footprint. And interestingly enough, you'll notice that the boundary wall between 12 and 13 isn't a straight line as it is here. And that's because it reflects a medieval boundary between two parcels of land that were part of the Lincoln's Inn Field. So he was able to use that to create little pockets for the Shakespeare Gallery and the Tivoli recess on the floors, on the landings going up here. But here we're looking at number 14, which he acquired in 1822 and then rebuilt. The house was turned into a rental house and eventually left to his grandchildren. But again, the area behind it became the picture room and the monk's yard, the Gothic cemetery as described by Schinkel. A salient aspect of Soane's displays is the avoidance of chronology or segregation of objects according to Greek, Roman, or post-classical typology. In various parts of the building, composite marble busts, cinerary urns, architectural fragments, and plaster casts vie for our attention. But it is interesting to note that Soane's written comments in his guides refer primarily to aesthetic subjects such as the striking effects of light and shade, as well as the sources of the works purchased or donated to the collection, i.e. the provenance. The whole ensemble could be described as variations upon a theme, although a better explanation of such juxtapositions may be found in Soane's statement that these, like all his works, had been arranged as studies for my own mind. Teasingly, he never explained what he meant by that phrase, thus withholding information from the visitor. Yet the overriding logic seems one of visual opportunism and associations rather than a purely antiquarian impulse. Soane was definitely not an antiquarian. The one focal point in Soane's planning was, of course, the dome area. We're looking at two different views of it here, which was reserved for his most important pieces. And still today, when one steps in it, leaving the house behind and going into what he would have called the museum, it is like stepping into the mind of an 18th century architect. This drawing of 1818 shows the same area, but with the Apollo Belvedere, which is now a fixture, it was from 1812, but not in the position it now holds, but on the east side of the dome area with a cast of the Medici Venus in the place which was eventually taken by the Apollo Belvedere. Behind Apollo's head is a cast of the entablature of the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, which was subsequently moved to the museum corridor during the expansion of the museum and galleries between 1822 and 1824, just outside the picture room. And you can see to the right of Apollo the large Apulian crater known as the Cawdor vase, standing on a ledge adjacent to Apollo. The vase dominates a suite of vases that now adorn the window in Soane's dining room. We're looking at them here. They're a heterogeneous group which includes two Chinese, 18th century Chinese vases and Italian ones, arranged symmetrically around the Cador vase at the middle. The underlying principle here seems to be purely aesthetic, which is confirmed by the evidence that Soane set his assistants the task of copying variations on a theme like vases from his collection, considering this as part of their artistic training. And here I'm showing you a drawing of watercolors, one of several, which his students were set, showing vases, both classical and medieval, reflecting different forms. And I think what he's interested in here is the commonality throughout the centuries of these works of art. But in addition, this suite of vases in the dining room are also framed by two curvilinear pieces of ash from a tree that was struck by lightning. You can see them here. Well, they aren't usually talked about, but in fact, they are, I think, fundamental in explaining his, or illuminating his idea that art imitated nature, that these natural forms have a curvilinear design which was related to works like the Cador vase. It has been observed that Soane's library and his collection of antiquities were essentially, what mattered about them was the idea behind the object, the story that it told, and the connections and associations that it set off in Soane's mind. I've mentioned that a distinguished provenance counted for a great deal, and this vase was bought in 1800 by Soane, one of his first splurges, for £68 5 shillings, which was a considerable amount of money in those days, from the sale of the Baron Cador. Cador was an important collector who had his own house museum but had to sell up because of financial problems. But Cador, to give you an example or an idea of his importance, he was the person who originally commissioned Canova to do Cupid and Psyche, although he never owned it. That's another story. Thanks to its cost and conspicuous size, it subsequently stood in a place of honor under the dome for a number of years, set upon a ciborium-like structure of recycled marbles before being moved to the picture room and then finally to the dining room where it stands today. And you can perhaps just make out here in the center of the crypt there's a kind of ciborium structure of spolia, and on top of it was the Cador vase, and here you see the Apollo Belvedere and many of the other reliefs and heads, much as they are today. But the Cador vase itself was eclipsed in 1824 when Soane secured the large monolithic sarcophagus of the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I, which had been excavated by the Italian adventurer Giovanni Battista Belzoni in the Valley of the Kings in 1817. It was brought to London for exhibition before being placed on loan in the British Museum in 1821. Belzoni wanted £3,000 for it, which was a lot of money, and it was subsequently turned down by the trustees of the British Museum. There was some anxiety that it might leave the country, go to the Tsar of Russia, but Soane stepped in and acquired it for £2,000. It was the most expensive work of art that he ever acquired. And indeed, he had to knock a hole in the back of number 13 in order to lower it into the basement. Its arrival in 1824 was celebrated by 3 days of festivities, which really marked the high point of Soane's career as a collector and as a social figure. Soane invited his guests to view the sarcophagus by lamplight and employed a manufacturer of stained glass and a dealer in lighting to provide lamps throughout the house and inside the sarcophagus at a cost of £80, which was something like 4 times the annual wage of a laborer. And the reason why reason why he was interested in having this view by lamplight was that the limestone of which the sarcophagus is made is such that when you shine light on it, it glows yellow. And it is really quite, must have been striking. And in fact, there are accounts of this in people like Coleridge and Turner, among other people, coming to see this work during this 3-day extravaganza. And interestingly enough, of course, in those days, no one really had an inkling of the significance of the sarcophagus in terms of hieroglyphics. They were still being studied, and the key to hieroglyphics hadn't really been found when Soane bought it. So when Soane writes about it in his guidebook, he stresses its workmanship, the fact that it was hewn from 1 block of stone, which is an impressive thing, and he also refers to it as illustrative of the customs, art, religion, and government of a very ancient and learned people. And Soane grouped a few Egyptian pieces around the sarcophagus that he had, including 18 fragments from the lid, which had been forced open in the Middle Ages, and which, as contemporary illustrations indicate, he placed underneath it. And one can see this in a print by John Britton of 1827, as well as nearby a plaster cast of an Egyptian granite head, which Soane had acquired from the collection of a notable figure, the poet Samuel Rogers. And nearby was an Egyptian capital of black marble, which you see here in the 1827 engraving. And you see here now in its final resting place in the museum corridor. The Egyptian marble, black marble capital had been acquired from the estate of Robert Adam, together with numerous marble and plaster reliefs of classical and Renaissance works. This capital, as I said, was subsequently moved to the west wall of the museum corridor, where it now sits beneath a cast of the capital of the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, as if to suggest, like Soane's pasticcio, a commonality of vegetal motifs across the ancient world. The positioning of the Egyptian sarcophagus is central to Soane's agenda in his museum, for it sets the seal upon the funereal nature of what he referred to as the sepulchral chamber, with its collection of cinerary urns, the wooden lid of another Egyptian coffin, Roman busts and fragments, as well as memorials to British warriors slain in the Napoleonic Wars. Above this area, the bust of Soane looks across the void and the open sarcophagus below, while light streams down from the glass panels above. Visually, it appears to convey the idea of immortality, if not resurrection in a Christian sense. Soane wasn't really a conventional Christian, but it also seems to suggest the endurance of art and Soane's reputation through the works assembled here. Indeed, Soane's bust is flanked by statuettes of Michelangelo and Raphael, as if to suggest that Soane was part of this great tradition. Well, he was part of this great tradition, but I think he saw himself really as the culmination of it. Now, if the Soane Museum enjoys a renaissance of its own today, it may in part stem from the fact that it never succumbed to the professional classifications that developed in the museum world of the 19th and 20th centuries. Soane's display was highly personal, even autobiographical. It was constantly in flux until time stopped for him at his death on the 20th of January, 1837. One can occasionally find other museums with similar directional approach to viewing. In this context, I think the Barnes Collection in Philadelphia, which advocated a theory of continuity between the great art of the past and of the present, as well as the recurrence of certain forms, invites comparison. More intriguingly, Soane's pursuit of motifs across cultures calls to mind Aby Warburg's Memnosine Builder Atlas project, and there may have been a common link here through the writings of the Baron d'Ancoville and the belief he fostered of links between cultures through the migration of imagery and what d'Ancoville called an écriture figurée, that is, a figurative writing. This is a photograph taken in the 1920s of one of the panels that Abbe Warburg would like to work on, putting photographs of objects that he was interested in and trying to trace the connections between them. So we began this chapter with quotations from Gustav Wagen and Adolf Michaelis, who expressed a sense of perplexity about what they saw in Sohn's museum. Sohn's son, George Sohn, also criticized his father in a rather devastating newspaper article. He criticized his creative process in architecture as plundering motifs from an antiquity that were never meant to be together in the same place. Yet I think these strictures could be turned on their head, and Sohn's collection, and indeed his architecture, can be seen as a daring, if not always successful, strategy in combining such works. Undoubtedly, what visitors experience in the Sohn Museum today is the opposite of a museological display as conventionally understood. And Sohn's concept of his museum and its distinction from his house, which was in front of it, remained fluid until the very end. In this context, I think, and by way of conclusion, I want to recall a more positive response to Sohn's museological display from a younger contemporary. This was the Franco-German architect Jacques Ignace Hittorf, who published an appreciation of Sohn in 1836, just prior to Sohn's death. Hittorf's essay was written in response to a copy of a French edition of Sohn's privately printed description of his house and museum, which he had sent to the Parisian Society, the Société Libre des Beaux-Arts. The article by Hittorf contained a brief biography of Sohn and an appreciation of his works, especially the Bank of England, with what Hittorf described as its calculated effects of light and perspective, and concluded with remarks on Sohn's house for its ingenious sequence of spaces and magical treatment of light, colored glass, and mirrors, as well as its enormous quantities of riches. Hittorf ended his account by noting that the Sohn Museum not only contains all that could serve for the education of an architect, but everything that could render it attractive. Such an ensemble would be very precious, but it has an inestimable value in England, where the elements necessary for the instruction of architecture are comparatively lacking in its only public institution, the Royal Academy. And this, I think, is an important point, because at the Royal Academy from the beginning, painting took pride of place, since it offered more lucrative careers for budding artists than did sculpture or architecture. Indeed, if you look at the early summer exhibitions, the architects always complained that they're put in the least advantageous rooms and that no one really came to see their works. The sculptors tended to say much the same thing. Sohn was aware of this defect in the Royal Academy, and at one point it was feared that he might break away and start his own Academy of Architecture. But he did go on to play a prominent part in the establishment of what would become the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1834. And his collection of casts, models, drawings, and books would remain a major resource for the study of architecture until the end of the 19th century with the founding of the Architectural Association. But the irony is that he was establishing his personal presentation of resources for the study of architecture, just as larger public institutions were moving in a completely different direction. Thank you. Yes, Wendy.
Did he enjoy being a contrarian?
I think so. I think he saw himself as a misguided, misunderstood genius. I think that was part of his fascination with Napoleon, was along those lines, that he saw there was a kind of commonality of the two. And it seems rather contradictory that he would collect books by and about Napoleon and Josephine, and paintings, bronzes of him when he was, the arch enemy, and Soane was a pillar of the establishment. But that wasn't uncommon. There were a lot of people in London who were fascinated by Napoleon and had museums. In the 1820s, he was offered a ready-made Napoleon museum by a man named Sainsbury, but he turned it down because he wasn't interested. He didn't have space for it. Yes?
When was the interior of the Soane Museum photographed for the first time? Do we have photographic evidence already in the 19th century of the interiors?
There are graphic illustrations published in magazines in about 1880. Particularly the Hogarth, the Rake's Progress, was taken out of the picture room and put on stands in the drawing rooms on the first floor to make them more accessible to the public. And there is an illustration of that, which we actually used as an inspiration for displaying them in 2019 when we did a big Hogarth exhibition. We did a similar sort of thing in number 12. The earliest ones that I know of are probably the 1890s, and then around 1911. Particularly James Wilde, who was the curator in the 1880s and early 90s, and then Arthur Bolton did photography. But of course, until photography became part of publications, there was very little. But what is interesting is that you can see how much changed and how much was moved around in the 19th century because of these illustrations. And so you had another?
Did Adam exhibit his collections in any way, or were they just privately stashed away in his office in the house?
I think they were, it was more private, but he would have people come to his house, and of course seeing them elevated his position as an arbiter of these things. And I think Soane was certainly well aware of that, and he was a great admirer of Adam at a time when Adam had fallen out of fashion, which is why he could buy 9,000 drawings from Adam's niece in 1818, I think it was, for £800, And so we have this wonderful collection. And I think the interesting thing, someone once asked me, I think maybe it was the last time I lectured here, what did Soane think of Palladio? And I think basically not much, insofar as his, I think like people like Latrobe and others, he felt that Palladio and Vignola were, I think what Latrobe calls sort of the gatekeepers, and that they had narrowed the idea of the classical world of classical architecture, the variety. And he, in his lectures, Soane makes these rather aspersions, casts aspersions on Palladio, saying, that, someone like Vanbrugh, his architecture, although it's erratic, is much to be preferred to the frigidity of Palladianism and that sort of thing. And he says at certain points that, our architecture in Britain has been too much dominated by this kind of endless repetition of the same forms. And I think the one other thing that I was struck by was the fact that I came across something which you may know about, that at the French Academy, the study for the architects was that they would study ruins in the first year, and then in the second year they had a project to reconstruct something from these ruins. So, in a sense, what Soane is doing, in a way, is that same thing with his display. And once you remove these works from their original context, as with Piranese's Via Appia Antica, they become movable. It's a movable feast, and so therefore you can put them together as you like. So what Soane is in this moment before classical archaeology really takes hold, and in which people are much more creative and free in the way that they interpret these things. And I think that's the whole point of his display, that it's associations that he had, either because of his career or because he saw these kind of Dunkervillian ideas of the relationship of themes across cultures, that sort of thing. And that's why people like Wagner, and particularly someone like Michaelis, wouldn't really, just couldn't see what the point of all of this was, because everything had changed by the middle of the 19th century towards this much more, you have Greek, Roman, Etruscan, you have Oriental. In fact, in the middle of the 19th century, the BM, the British Museum, was reconstructed, the departments were constructed along these lines. So this whole idea that you had in the 18th century of the cabinet of curiosity, or the mixed intermingling of these things, was a snapped thread, as it were. Yes?
I'm wondering if those images played an important part in his architecture, or an important part in how he designed buildings. Were certain images used in certain buildings and others and other images in other buildings, or was that not very much a consideration for him?
Not really, I don't think. What he did believe is that you had to use motifs according to their original context. I mean, you could, as long as they made sense in a modern setting, but you had to have some understanding of what the original meaning was. He was more interested in it, I think, as a kind of private passion. For instance, there's an illustration of the bull striking an egg, which is supposed to be the creation of the universe, being worshipped by Japanese, and it's in Dunkerville's Recherche. And there was a bronze of this, which was owned by a friend of Soane's called Richard Cosway, a painter, and he bought that at Cosway's sale when he died in 1821. So it shows that he really put a value on this sort of thing. And of course, being a kind of free thinker, he wasn't really interested in Christianity, but he believed that, like a number of his contemporaries, that there was a kind of key to all mythologies that one could find. I'm trying to think of the name of the. I can't remember. I'm having a senior moment, but there is Payne Knight. Payne Knight, was again one of these people who also was very much subscribed to these ideas of Dunkerville, and also helped to pay for the Townley publication. And he himself published books on the classical world, but with very critical of Christianity, which was rather dangerous in those days.
I wonder how accurate they were. I mean, somebody like Gandy was very romantic in his approach to cities or architecture, and if they aren't actually accurate in terms, would that have upset some, or did he think, yes, this collection is here for inspiring contemporary artists?
No, it's an interesting point. I think there are two different things going on. One is, of course, something like this, which was displayed at the Royal Academy in 1822. It doesn't say where it is, but the idea is you're supposed to know that this is Soane's house, and it's before he bought number 14. But you get this view of the library dining room, two views of the library dining room, the courtyard, the monumental courtyard, the breakfast room, which then is now as much admired, his study. These things were shown at the Royal Academy summer exhibitions, so they would be seen by tens of thousands of people. In the early 19th century, as many as 60,000 people would see them, so they were a great advertisement for Soane and Gandy, and Soane would pay something like £50 to Gandy, which was an enormous amount of money, but Soane was not a particularly good draftsman. He had ideas, but he wasn't, he realized his limitations as a draftsman. Gandy wasn't a particularly good architect, but he was a great watercolorist. And in fact, Soane in one of his lectures says that, he warns architecture students not to follow the line of Clearaceau or Gandhi because you'll be putting too much attention on an area which isn't really central to your work as an architect. So, but also, a lot of these drawings, the ones that weren't exhibited, or even some of that were exhibited, were trials. Like he had one of the picture room with the Cawdor vase sitting on an Anglo-Indian ivory table. And we don't think it ever sat there, but it was, this is what it would look like. So it was like, Photoshop, as it were. But these works which we see today by Gandhi were very important because they were a way of putting Soane before the public, and also particularly his frustration over never designing a royal palace, never having the kind of opportunities that John Nash did. So, and he was delighted when Nash ran into trouble in 1831. And of course, he didn't get the Buckingham Palace, but he got the knighthood, whereas Nash didn't. Nash was persona non grata with William IV. Yes?
You mentioned the restoration of a particular structure at some point during the talk, and that had me wondering whether any organization has undertaken a broader restoration or preservation effort of the House Museum, or if it's remained sort of in pristine condition.
But the Soane Museum?
Yeah.
Well, the Soane Museum is a national museum. It's the smallest national museum, and it was unusual in that Soane went to Parliament in 1833, lobbied a private member's bill to turn the house and the collection into a public museum. And this was much debated at the time in Parliament because it was rather like the debate that happened 100 years earlier when the British Museum was being established. What do you mean by public?
Yeah.
Should you charge admission? Can anyone go? Or should it just be for certain people? And in the end, it was also the other debate was the fact that Soane was disinheriting his son, his surviving son George, with whom he had fallen out, and it was considered unnatural to do that. And Sir Robert Peel suggested that instead Soane's collection could be given to the British Museum, and then the £30,000 that was going to be put aside by Soane as an endowment, which again was the first time this had ever happened, could be given to his family. But Soane was insistent. So when the bill was passed, it said that it could either go to the British Museum or be a private museum, depending on what Sir John Soane decided. And of course, he wanted it to be his house, his museum. And I think he probably had the prescience to realize that a lot of his architecture wouldn't survive. He was obsessed with this idea, and he even had Gandhi do Bank of England in ruins, which certainly anticipates what happened in the 1920s. But because it was, there were debates over in the 19th and early 20th century as to what, is it a national museum, is it a national resource, or is it a private foundation that's administered publicly? And this is what the trustees, they took a very narrow view of this. And in 1938, there was a parliamentary committee which was investigating museums, and they came to the Soane with the recommendation that it be open more days a week. I think it was only open 3 or 4 days a week, and open more of the year. It was closed for about 4 months of the year, but also that it should be rearranged along museological lines by a group of experts. And the trustees resisted this, and fortunately, I suppose for them, the war came along. And after the war, John Summerson became the curator, and he convinced the trustees that they had to make it more accessible. But also, the major problem was restoring the fabric and putting things back which had been put into hiding with things from the National Gallery and the British Museum in Wales and elsewhere. So that was the beginning of this. And then in the 1980s, my predecessor, Peter Thornton, repainted the drawing rooms on the first floor yellow, which was very controversial at the time, but we know that that was the original color. And then that was the beginning of what we called opening up the Soane, which was restoring these places and also decanting the vitrines, the offices, etc., from number 13 and putting them into the adjacent houses, which were acquired. Well, number 14 was acquired in 1996, and then restoring the private apartments on the second floor, which, if you haven't been, is again, it was a tour de force before my time, but of recreating, restoring a lost aspect of this thing. So today we get money from the government, but we have to raise money, of course, to make sure that we can maintain these things, and also educational programs, exhibitions, and the like.
I think we're about out of time.
Okay,
Thank you very
sorry.
much.